This is Harsh Rules. I'm Ben Harsh, and today we're going to learn to play Axis and Allies 1942, the second edition. Axis and Allies 1942 was released in 2012 by Wizards of the Coast and supports up to 5 players. The game was designed by Larry Harris Jr. and takes about 3 to 5 hours to play. Axis and Allies 1942 follows the streamlined approach introduced in Axis and Allies 1941. However, this is a much more advanced version of Axis and Allies than the introductory version 1941. This is the current family of Axis and Allies. The Little Sister 1941 is for beginning players. The middle sister of the family is Axis and Allies 1942. This is the standard edition of the game. Her big sisters are the twins, Axis and Allies Europe 1940 and Pacific 1940. These games are for advanced players. You can play these 1940 games individually or together as the Global Edition. In an earlier video, we covered the introductory version of Axis and Allies 1941. This is a great starting place for new players because the game plays much more quickly than 1942 or either of the 1940 variants. 1942 is the full experience Axis and Allies game, and that's what we're going to learn today. Now, to be clear, this tutorial will cover the second edition of Axis and Allies 1942. There was an earlier edition, which is considered the first edition, which is titled Axis and Allies Spring 1942, The World is at War. As you can see from the game boards below, the second edition is very different from the Spring 1942 edition. So keep that in mind, since some of the rules in the second edition are completely new and do not appear in the Spring 1942 edition. With that said, let's get started. First, let's take a look at the game objective. Axis and Allies 1942 is a strategy game that covers the global conflict of World War II. 5 players are divided into 2 alliances fighting for global control. The Allied powers, represented by the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, and the United States. And the Axis powers, represented by Germany and Japan. Each nation has a number of key victory cities. 7 victory cities under the control of the Allied powers, and 6 victory cities under the control of the Axis powers. On the Allied side, the Soviet Union has Moscow and Leningrad. The United Kingdom has London and Calcutta. The United States has Washington, Los Angeles, and Honolulu. On the Axis side, Germany has Berlin, Rome, and Paris. Japan has Tokyo, Shanghai, and Manila. To achieve total victory, one of the alliances must control 13 victory cities to win the game. If you'd like to play a shorter game, you can opt for the standard victory conditions. For the Allies to win, they must control 10 victory cities. For the Axis to win, they must control 9 victory cities. Axis and Allies follows the classic territory control game model. The cycle begins with territory conquest. Battles for territory control are decided by dice rolls. The lower the result, the better. If the attack fails, then the defender retains control of the territory. If the attack is successful, the invader seizes control. Territory conquest leads to economic power. Many territories add to economic power in the form of industrial production. A territory's industrial production points translate directly into industrial production credits. With greater economic power, you can afford to increase arms production, which in turn leads to more territory conquest. And the cycle repeats itself until one alliance has captured the necessary victory cities to win the game. Whenever you capture a new territory, you adjust your placement on the industrial production chart at the top of the board. Likewise, the player that lost the territory adjusts their placement down. This helps communicate your standing to all players and keeps track of the number of industrial production certificates you earn per turn. In previous Axis and Allies games, there was an economic victory that could occur when you reached a certain level. Axis and Allies 1942, the second edition, merely focuses on victory city attainment. Now that we have a fundamental understanding of the game mechanics, it's time to get the game out. So, get your bits together, people. It's time to set up the game. First, find the setup cards for each nation in the game box. These setup cards list each of the nation's territories with unit setups. In the upper right-hand corner is the nation's starting industrial production credits, or IPCs. The game's instructions suggest you keep track of these on a separate tablet of paper, but I would go ahead and steal currency from one of the older versions of the game. Since Axis and Allies 1942 has so many pieces, you're going to want to use chips to conserve space on the game board. The figure on top of a stack represents one unit. A gray chip represents an additional unit, a green chip 3 additional units, and a red chip 5 additional units. Keep these resources in mind as you set up your own game. This is an enhanced view of the Axis and Allies 1942 game board. The Axis and Allies games are notorious for game clutter. In an effort to minimize this, I've created a number of icons and enhancements to help us learn the game. Control markers and industrial production points are now merged and color-coded. Red represents the U.S.S.R. Black represents Germany. Tan represents the United Kingdom. Orange represents Japan. And green represents the United States. These colors are also synchronized with the colors of figures that you place on the board. When a lot of game pieces are placed on the board, it can be hard to tell what the units are, especially in the case of naval units. I've created this iconography to the right to help us sort this out. Keep these in mind as we walk through the tutorial. Proceeding through the nations in play order, we're going to set up the U.S.S.R. first. In Russia, place 4 infantry, 1 artillery, 1 anti-aircraft artillery, 1 fighter, and an industrial complex. In Karelia, place 4 infantry, 1 artillery, 1 fighter, and an industrial complex. In Archangel, place 1 infantry and 1 tank. In Novosibirsk, place 1 infantry. In the Caucasus, place 3 infantry, 1 artillery, 1 anti-aircraft artillery, 1 tank, and an industrial complex. In Kazakh, place 1 infantry. In Okrug, place 2 infantry. In Yakut, place 1 infantry. In Buryatia, place 2 infantry. In the Soviet Far East, place 2 infantry. And finally, in Sea Zone 4, place 1 submarine. Now the U.S.S.R. is set up and ready for play. Next, we're going to set up the German forces. In Germany itself, 3 infantry, 1 anti-aircraft artillery, 2 tanks, 1 fighter, 1 bomber, and an industrial complex. In France, 1 infantry, 1 anti-aircraft artillery, and 2 tanks. Northwestern Europe, 1 infantry, 1 tank, 1 fighter. Norway, 2 infantry, 1 fighter. Finland, 3 infantry. The Baltic states, 1 infantry and 1 tank. Poland, 2 infantry, 1 tank, 1 fighter. Bulgaria, 2 infantry, 1 tank, 1 fighter. Italy, 1 infantry, 1 anti-aircraft artillery, 1 tank, and an industrial complex. Southern Europe, 1 infantry, 1 artillery. Ukraine, 3 infantry, 1 artillery, 1 tank, 1 fighter. Belarusia, 3 infantry. West Russia, 3 infantry, 1 artillery, 1 tank. Morocco, 1 infantry and 1 artillery. Algeria, 1 infantry and 1 artillery. Libya, 1 infantry and 1 tank. Sea Zone 5, 1 cruiser, 2 submarines, and 1 transport. Sea Zone 9, 2 submarines. Sea Zone 15, 1 battleship and 1 transport. And with that, Germany is set up and ready to play. Now we're going to set up the United Kingdom. In England itself, 2 infantry, 1 artillery, 1 anti-aircraft artillery, 1 tank, 2 fighters, 1 bomber, and an industrial complex. In Eastern Canada, 1 tank. In Egypt, 1 infantry, 1 tank, 1 artillery, 1 fighter. In South Africa, 1 infantry. In Transjordan, 1 infantry. Persia, 1 infantry. India, 3 infantry, 1 anti-aircraft artillery, and an industrial complex. In Burma, 1 infantry. Eastern Australia, 2 infantry. Western Australia, 1 infantry. New Zealand, 1 infantry. Western Canada, 1 infantry. In Sea Zone 7, 1 battleship and 1 transport. Sea Zone 10, 1 destroyer, 1 transport. Sea Zone 14, 1 cruiser. Sea Zone 17, 1 destroyer. Sea Zone 35, 1 aircraft carrier with 1 fighter, 1 cruiser, 1 transport. Sea Zone 39, 1 cruiser, 1 transport, 1 submarine. And with that, the United Kingdom is set up and ready to play. Next, we're going to set up Japan, which is in the Pacific Theater. The island of Japan has 4 infantry, 1 artillery, 1 anti-aircraft artillery, 1 tank, 1 fighter, 1 bomber, and an industrial complex. Manchuria has 3 infantry and 1 fighter. Jiangsu has 4 infantry. Kwangtung has 1 infantry and 1 artillery. Iwo Jima has 1 infantry. Okinawa has 1 infantry. Wake Island has 1 infantry. Indochina has 2 infantry, 1 artillery, and 1 fighter. Malaya has 1 infantry. East Indies has 2 infantry. Borneo has 1 infantry. New Guinea has 1 infantry. The Solomon Islands have 1 infantry. The Caroline Islands have 1 infantry. And the Philippine Islands have 1 infantry and 1 artillery. Sea Zone 37 has 1 aircraft carrier with 2 fighters and 1 battleship. Sea Zone 44 has 1 submarine. Sea Zone 50 has 1 aircraft carrier with 1 fighter and 1 cruiser. Sea Zone 60 has 1 battleship, 1 transport, and 1 destroyer. Sea Zone 61, 1 transport, 1 destroyer. And with that, Japan is set up and ready for play. Now we're going to set up the United States European Theater Forces. In the eastern United States, 2 infantry, 1 artillery, 1 anti-aircraft artillery, 1 tank, 1 fighter, 1 bomber, and 1 industrial complex. In the central United States, 1 infantry. In Sea Zone 11, 1 destroyer and 2 transports. In Sea Zone 19, 1 cruiser. A quick note for the United States player: Brazil, Central America, and the West Indies have no forces. Now we're going to place the United States Pacific Theater Forces. Alaska has 1 infantry unit. The Western United States has 2 infantry units, 1 AAA, 1 fighter, and 1 industrial complex. Midway Island has 1 infantry unit. The Hawaiian Islands have 1 infantry unit and 1 fighter. Yunnan has 2 infantry units. Sichuan has 2 infantry units and 1 fighter. Anhui has 2 infantry units. Sea Zone 53 has 1 aircraft carrier with 1 fighter, 1 destroyer, and 1 submarine. Sea Zone 56 has 1 battleship, 1 destroyer, and 1 transport. And now all of the nations are set up and ready for play. Now that we've got the game set up, let's slow down just a little bit and I'll teach you how to play. We're going to begin by looking at the phases of gameplay. In each round of gameplay, the nations take their turn in an established sequence. The first nation to play is the Soviet Union, followed by Germany, then the United Kingdom, next Japan, and finally the United States. Each player's turn is divided into 6 phases. In Phase 1, a player will purchase units. Phase 2, they'll conduct combat moves. In Phase 3, they conduct the actual combat. In Phase 4, any remaining non-combat moves are made. In Phase 5, the player will mobilize the new units that they've purchased. And in Phase 6, they will collect income. Next, we're going to walk through each of these phases in greater detail. In Phase 1, a player will purchase units. This process falls into 3 steps. First, you're going to order your units. Next, you're going to pay for those units. This is one of the reasons why I like to use currency in the game. I feel more comfortable watching currency move out of a player's area than trusting that they're doing the math correctly on their notepad. Finally, you're going to place the units you've purchased in the mobilization zone. The mobilization zone is located in the lower right-hand corner of the game board. The mobilization zone area also provides a reminder of the cost of each unit, how far it can move, its attack and defense. Now let's take a closer look at the units in the game and compare how much they cost. Let's look at Phase 1, Purchase Units. This is a chart of all the units available in Axis and Allies 1942. At the bottom of the chart, I've included a row of the cost of each of these units. Land units are the most cost-effective, from 3 IPCs for infantry up to 6 IPCs for tanks. Aircraft are a lot more expensive, at 10 IPCs for fighters and 12 IPCs for bombers. Naval units are the most expensive, starting out at 6 IPCs for submarines and going all the way up to 20 IPCs for a battleship. Finally, creating additional industrial complexes is not cheap and costs 15 IPCs apiece. Be sure to manage your military spending budget carefully, because the units you purchase at the beginning of your turn are placed in the mobilization zone, and you don't get to deploy those to the battlefield to the end of your turn. As a result, battles in between can change your military strategy, so you need to be sure that you're planning ahead for any contingency. Next, it's on to Phase 2, Combat Moves. In Phase 2, players will conduct their combat moves. When conducting combat moves, it's important to note each unit's striking range to a target. Artillery and infantry can move 1 territory and strike. Infantry and artillery can move 1 zone to conduct a strike. Tanks and naval units can move 2 zones to conduct a strike. Air units must divide their combat moves into 2 parts. Aircraft must have enough movement to reach their target and then return to a safe landing zone. Fighters have a range of 4 zones that they can conduct airstrikes. Bombers have a range of 6 zones. The following is an optional bunker rule you can use when playing the game. I saw this trick on one of Young Grasshopper's videos over at the Cliffside Bunker. It's simple and ingenious, and I think it should be in the regular rule book, but I'll leave it here as optional. When using this optional bunker rule, take a handful of control markers and flip them over to the white side. As you plan your combat moves, place these white markers in each of the territories that you're going to conduct combat in the next phase. Next, in Phase 3, Conduct Combat, you'll find each of these white markers and resolve the combat in each area. This is a great optional rule for 2 reasons. First, it helps the attacking player keep track of all their battles. Second, it creates an agenda of upcoming battles for the other players. Players not involved in the upcoming battle agenda can take a break, get a Coke, go to the bathroom, whatever. Everyone has a fair estimate of how long the next section of gameplay is going to last. The Axis and Allies community has put thousands of hours into these games. Over all these game sessions, they've developed a number of techniques to get the most out of the gameplay. So give this optional bunker rule a shot. It really streamlines the game. And for other great Axis and Allies ideas and gameplay components, check out their Axis and Allies channels on YouTube. Now on to Phase 3, the highlight of the game for most people, conduct combat. First, let's look at the Army. The first key land unit are infantry. Infantry attack on a 1 and defend on a 2. What this means is that if you are attacking with infantry, you need to roll a 1 to score a hit. If you are defending, you need to roll a 2 or less to score a hit. Next, we have tanks that attack on a 3 and defend on a 3. Artillery that attack on a 2 and defend on a 2. If you pair one artillery piece with one infantry unit, then your infantry can attack on a 2 and defend on a 2. Finally, we have AAA guns, which are anti-aircraft artillery guns. These do not attack or defend in a traditional sense. AAA guns only fire at the beginning of an attack and only at air units that are flying in. One AAA gun can fire at up to 3 planes each. The AAA gun hits on a roll of 1 versus aircraft. Next, let's look at the Air Force. The Air Force is comprised of 2 different units. The fighter can attack on a 3 or less and defend on a 4 or less. Bombers can attack on a 4 or less and defend on a 1. Now let's look at naval units. First, we have the battleship that attacks on a 4 or less and defends on a 4 or less. Next is the aircraft carrier that attacks on a 1 but defends on a 2 or less. Cruisers attack on a 3 or less and defend on a 3 or less. Destroyers attack on a 2 or less and defend on a 2 or less. Transports cannot attack or defend. Submarines attack on a 2 or less and defend on a 1. Once you've made all the combat moves, then it's time to resolve all the battles that resulted from them. Each battle is resolved in 6 steps. The first step is to place units. To do this, we are going to use the battle strip and the casualty zone strip. Attacking units are placed above the strip in their appropriate section. Defending units are placed below the strip in their specific section. The numbers in the center correspond with the dice rolls you need or less to score a hit. The second step is broken into 2 parts, 2A and 2B. 2A occurs if you have aircraft attacking and the defender has anti-aircraft guns. Each anti-aircraft gun can fire at up to 3 aircraft units. An anti-aircraft gun only gets to fire at 1 unit with 1 dice, but on a roll of 1, they score a hit and destroy the aircraft. Step 2A only occurs once at the beginning of the battle. After that, you skip this step and move on. Step 2B refers to naval battles and if submarines are involved. Submarines have 2 special abilities in combat. The first is that they can conduct a surprise strike. This is an attack that precedes the normal rounds of combat. The second special ability is to submerge. If a submarine decides to submerge, then they immediately leave the battle. Step 2 in the combat sequence is repeated each round of combat until either all submarines are destroyed or they've submerged and left. In Step 3, the attacking units fire. So let's play through this little mini battle and I'll show you how this works. The American attackers in this example have 1 tank and 1 infantry, so we're going to roll a dice for each. First we roll for the tank and we get a 4. We need a 3 or less to hit, so a 4 is a miss. Next we roll for the infantry and we get a 1, which is a hit. Now when the attacker scores a hit, the defender gets to choose which of his 2 units he wants to take as a casualty. The German defender is going to choose his infantryman as a casualty and move him into the casualty zone. Now that the attacker has finished firing, it's the defender's turn to fire back. The key point to remember here is that this battle is occurring simultaneously between both sides. Therefore, while the infantryman is a casualty, he still gets 1 shot before he's removed from the battle. So now let's complete the defender's returning fire. The German defender rolls for his tank, and he gets a 2, which is a hit. Next, he rolls for his dying infantryman, and he rolls a 1, which is another hit. This eliminates all the American units, and they're immediately removed from the board. Remember, the casualty zone is just to keep track of the defender casualties. Now that the defenders have returned fire, it's time for step 5 to remove the defender's casualties. And we say goodbye to our German infantry friend. Now if the battle continued, you'd move to step 6 where you get to make a choice. You can choose to press the attack, which means you're going to go through another round of combat, or you can choose to retreat and end the battle. And that concludes our little combat example. Next up, Phase 4, non-combat moves. Phase 4 is non-combat moves. For this phase, you're only going to move units that have not previously moved to conduct combat. Also, any planes that have conducted combat, now you need to complete their flight plan and bring them home. Next, let's talk about the transit rules for each zone, starting with land transit rules. Transit rules are divided into permitted and not permitted movements. First, what is permitted? Land units can enter and capture undefended territories. This includes territories with industrial complexes and anti-aircraft artillery. With a tank unit, you can perform a blitz movement. A tank unit can move into an empty territory, plant a control marker, and then blitz into the next territory. If the second territory is hostile, they can then conduct an attack. Per the rules, in the first territory, if there's an industrial complex or an anti-aircraft artillery piece, the tank cannot perform a blitz. They must stop there. Next, let's take a look at the non-permitted land transit rules. Anti-aircraft artillery can only make non-combat moves. They cannot move into a hostile territory and conduct combat. Land forces in general cannot make a non-combat move into a hostile territory. And finally, land units cannot enter neutral territories. Now let's look at sea transit rules. First, what is permitted? Enemy submarines and transport units on their own cannot block transit. And enemy aircraft carriers, battleships, cruisers, and submarines cannot block submarine transit. Now, what is not permitted? Enemy aircraft carriers, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers block surface transit. If a destroyer is present, it nullifies a submarine's submersion ability, so they cannot pass through the sea zone if a destroyer is present. Now, let's look at air transit rules. First, what is permitted? Air units may fly over hostile land or sea zones. Air units may also pass over neutral territories. Strangely, I could not find any non-permitted air transit rules in the rulebook. With all the focus on self-defending industrial complexes and anti-aircraft artillery, they didn't actually put in a rule that I could find for air transit. Therefore, you may use this optional bunker rule. If an air unit passes over a territory with an anti-aircraft gun, then that gun can fire at the passing unit. One AAA may target up to 3 air units with 1 dice per air unit. A roll of a 1 is a hit and one of the air units is removed. Now it's time for Phase 5, mobilize the new units. Player turn Phase 5 is mobilize new units. In this phase, we're going to take the units that we placed in the mobilization zone in Phase 1 and move them to the territories on the board. New units can only mobilize at a nation's industrial complex. Each industrial complex can only mobilize the number of units equal to the economic power in the territory it's within. Here, I've identified all the industrial complexes on the game board and the amount of units they can mobilize per turn. This will give you an idea of the overall production power of each nation. And finally, Phase 6, collect income. Finally, in Step 6, you get to collect income. Review your position on the industry track at the top of the board and collect that amount of income. You can complete this task in one of 3 ways. Option 1, become an accountant and create a ledger. Method 2, an old copy of Axis and Allies makes the ultimate sacrifice. Method 3, make Monopoly support the war effort. Now that we've covered the phases of gameplay, let's look at unit abilities and special attacks. Axis and Allies 1942 has a lot of naval units. Let's take a look at some of the attack vessels and their different abilities. The cheapest naval attack vessel besides submarines are destroyers. They cost 8 IPCs and can attack on a 2 and defend on a 2. They can also cancel out submarine abilities. The middle ground of naval attack vessels is the cruiser. In my mind, cruisers are budget battleships. They cost 12 IPCs and attack and defend on a 3. They also have the ability to conduct offshore shelling during an amphibious assault. The top of the line attack vessel is the battleship. Battleships cost 20 IPCs and attack and defend on a 4. They also can conduct offshore shelling during an amphibious assault. Besides the additional attack power, the difference between a battleship and a cruiser is that they can take 2 hits before they're destroyed. Keep these units in mind when planning conquest on the high seas. Submarines and destroyers are the foxes and hounds of the ocean. Submarines have 3 main abilities that make them unique. Submarines cannot be hit by air units. They can conduct secret strikes at the beginning of an attack. And they have a submersion ability that allows them to remain undetected. Destroyers, besides being an attack vessel, nullify these submarine abilities. When a destroyer is present in the same sea zone as an enemy submarine, they can be hit by air units, they cannot conduct secret strikes, and they cannot submerge. Transports are key in Axis and Allies 1942. Transports can carry 1 passenger in the form of an infantry unit and 1 cargo. The cargo can be an additional infantry unit, a tank, an AAA gun, or a howitzer. Cargo can be one of the following: an infantry unit, or a tank, or an AAA gun, or an artillery piece. Loading and unloading these units uses up their movement for the turn. Transports also have a number of special abilities. They are always the last units removed from a battle. Transports are alliance friendly. This means you can load and unload units from any member of your alliance. Transports can also participate in amphibious assaults. This is the only time that units being unloaded from a transport can immediately conduct an attack. Next, we're going to talk about strategic bombing raids. This version of Axis and Allies has some interesting changes to the rules. According to the rulebook, the new industrial complexes have built-in defenses. Wow, that sounds authentic. So basically, when bombers attack the industrial complex, you roll 1 dice for each bomber. For each roll of a 1, one of the bombers is destroyed. Any bombers that make it through get to roll 1 dice. The result of this dice equates to the industrial damage. Industrial damage is recorded by the chips placed beneath the industrial complex. A gray chip equals 1 damage. A green chip equals 3 damage, and a red chip equals 5 damage. These damage points reduce a territory's industrial production capacity. For example, if one bomber conducted a strategic bombing raid on Germany and rolled a 3, then Germany could only produce 7 units per turn. A territory's industry can suffer up to twice its IPC value. In this case, Germany could have a damaged industry up to 20. To restore production capacity, a player must pay IPCs to remove chips. The cost is 1 IPC per damage point. As an official optional rule, players can opt to have a 2-stage strategic bombing raid. In the first stage, there's an aerial battle, where bombers can be escorted by friendly fighters. Enemy fighters can take to the skies as interceptors and attack them. In this sequence, the escorts shoot first and hit on a roll of 1. Once any hit interceptors are removed, the interceptors can then fight back. They roll 1 dice per interceptor and hit on a 2 or less. After a single round of combat, the fighter escorts and interceptors withdraw. The bombers proceed to Stage 2, the air raid, and the strategic bombing raid continues as normal. I like this rule because it gives the Air Force more to do and creates some depth to the strategic bombing raid strategy. Now, let's look at amphibious assaults and how they work. An amphibious assault is broken down into 3 phases. Phase 1 is a sea battle along a hostile shoreline. Phase 2 is offshore bombardment, but only if there's not a sea battle. And Phase 3 is the actual landing and assault. During a sea battle, attacking and defending forces duke it out for control of the shoreline. Transports and their cargo cannot attack during the battle, but they can be casualties. Any of the attacker's air units involved in the amphibious assault must choose where they're going to conduct their battle, either at sea or over land. If there is no sea battle, then battleships and cruisers may shell enemy forces on the shore. Finally, transports land on the shore and disembark their cargo and passengers. These units immediately engage enemy forces on the shore. Air units may participate in the land battle if they were not engaged at the sea battle. And that's how you conduct an amphibious assault. One last piece to go over is the rules for occupation. Inevitably, during the course of the game, a player's capital is going to be invaded and occupied. This is how that sequence works. After a successful invasion, the occupier collects all IPCs in that nation's treasury. Once the treasury has been raided, however, going forward, that invader can only collect IPCs from regions in that nation that they control. The nation that is being occupied cannot collect income and they cannot buy new units. However, Units in unconquered regions can fight on as a sort of resistance. A nation's capital must be liberated to return national economy and war production. And that wraps up this edition of Harsh Rules. I'm Ben Harsh, and I thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you on the next episode.